And so it's a great pleasure to have you in our alma mater, because in a way it's our only alma mater too. So welcome.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Simone, and Cassio, and Eduardo for your remarks. And yes, a number of wonderful students have come from CEDEPLAR to Berkeley, and it has been a great pleasure to work with them and then to see them come back here and join the faculty. In some cases has also been wonderful, and so I'm just very pleased to be here myself and to see the campus and see the actual program and this wonderful infrastructure, this wonderful university. So I'm going to be talking about population aging and intergenerational transfers, and I will put an emphasis on Latin America and Brazil, but it will be placed in a global context. And I will be drawing on results from the this project, the National Transfer Accounts Project. So I understand that some of you have just come from a class that Eduardo was teaching for 3 hours on the demographic transition this morning. I'm going to talk for 3 minutes about the demographic transition in Latin America, and then I'll talk about age profiles of labor, income, and consumption from the National Transfer Account Project, and then support ratios and their changes.
And use the mic.
I need the mic? Okay.
It's on.
It's on. Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
And human capital, and then how the elderly are supported, and then finally I'll draw some conclusions from all of that. I want to keep track of time. So first I want to say this work draws on the national transfer accounts. The national transfer accounts come from individual teams in each country. And so I'm very grateful to those teams, and I just wanted to briefly list, I probably missed some people on these teams, but the Latin American country teams, these are newer Latin American members. And now here we also have some people from Ecuador and El Salvador who are visiting and I think starting NTA now. Okay, so to begin with the demographic transition. This is the process by which virtually all countries have moved or are moving from a situation of high mortality and high fertility to eventual, we expect, low fertility and low mortality. And as they pass through this process, there are some quite predictable and regular changes in the population age distribution, and I think of those changes in the age distribution as also part of the demographic transition. Most demographic transitions follow a classic pattern, but I've learned that Latin America has many important exceptions to these standard classic patterns, and perhaps if we learn more about other third world regions, it will turn out that every region has many important exceptions. So in the classic pattern, the transition begins when mortality begins to decline, and then it may be another 5 decades or something like that before fertility also begins to decline, and in between there is rapid population growth, the population becomes young, and so on. But we'll look at that in a moment. Okay, so in most third world countries, the fertility declines began in the mid 1960s. Mortality decline typically began much earlier, perhaps in third world countries around 1900, in European countries perhaps around 1800. And as I said, in Latin America, these generalizations don't hold up so well in many cases. So, just to make this more concrete, I'm going to begin by looking at the demographic transition in Mexico, historically from 1900 to the present, and then as it's projected by the United Nations through to 2100. So the Mexican demographic transition is somewhat classic in its appearance in that mortality decline began around 1900, and the fertility decline didn't begin until, I think, in the 1960s. So that's sort of classic. Fertility is now 2.3 in Mexico, and life expectancy is high. It's about the same as the United States at 77 years. But the Mexican Revolution was a big sort of demographic shock early in the century, as we'll see. And then also there's been quite high net out migration, which will affect particularly the evolution of the population and age structure in the 21st century. So I'm going to draw on some historical data from work by Hector Perez-Brignoli, a Costa Rican historical demographer, and then UN data as well. So here we have the Mexican demographic transition, 1900 to 2100 on the horizontal axis here, the total fertility rate on the vertical axis in this first panel, and so here we have the effects of the Mexican Revolution and this big dip in fertility, an early dip. It's maybe some other things are going on because this is a bit early. You see the generally high fertility and then very steep decline and then a projected leveling off. Of course, we don't know where leveling off will occur. I understand Brazil is now at TFR of 1.8. Who knows how low that's going to go. So the standard assumptions of a leveling off at around replacement level may be unrealistic. Life expectancy you see here starting to rise from a level of about 30 years life expectancy at birth, disturbed by the Mexican Revolution, and then this steady increase, and again, of course, we don't know where it's going to end, but projected by the UN to level off at around 80. And we have the growth rate down to 0 during the revolution, but then accelerating to over 3% per year, very rapid growth in the 1960s, and then fertility decline. And it's projected, as you see, by the United Nations to drop below 0 around 2040 and turn seriously negative, so that when we look at the projections of population size here, we get this pattern, and that is partly because of the projected low fertility, but it's also because of projected continuation of net outmigration. Now, what I want to focus on is the dependency ratios in this last panel, and so let's look at them more closely. This is the same slide, the same panel, just blown up here. So the red is the youth dependency ratio, the ratio of population under 15 to 15 to 64. And the first effect of mortality decline is that the presence of children in the population increases as more and more children survive from birth into older childhood. A decline in child mortality is very much like an increase in fertility. So we see the youth dependency ratio actually rising in this first stage of the transition when mortality is declining but fertility is still high. This, of course, is the Mexican Revolution effect again. Then we have a long period of declining youth dependency and then a projected leveling off. And here we have in the green old age dependency ratio, which is low but then rises steeply after about 2000 and is projected to level off at about 0.4 elderly per working age. Of course, these age boundaries are arbitrary. It's quite possible people will be working longer in the future and so on. We'll look at these in more country-specific detail in a moment. Now, when we add together the youth dependency and the old age dependency, we get this total dependency ratio, and this pattern, let's abstract from the revolution, but this pattern, some sort of sinusoidal pattern over 2 centuries, is a typical classic pattern in the demographic transition. So we have dependency ratios, getting total dependency ratio rising and then falling dramatically over maybe 50, 60 years here, and then rising again with population aging, and then we reach a new equilibrium that's not very different for the total dependency ratio than the original total dependency ratio. But the difference is that in the beginning, we have many child dependents and very few elderly dependents, and at the end, we have relatively few child dependents and we have many elderly dependents. And that difference has very profound consequences. Okay, now why do we care about the changing population age distribution? We care because economic activity varies with age. We behave differently when we're children and when we're say in our 40s or when we're in our 70s. Children consume more than they produce. The elderly consume more than they produce. In between, we have the prime working ages in which people are producing more than they consume, producing a surplus. And we will be looking at those economic life cycles in more detail in a moment. I'll be referring to the NTA estimates, and the data year for these estimates varies from country to country. Some of these data years are fairly recent. Brazil now, in what I'll be showing, is from 2004. Some of the data are from older years. For example, I think the Uruguay data I'll be showing is from 1994. Now, we're trying to update the estimates where we can, but it depends on the availability of surveys and national accounts data and so on. Okay, let me begin by talking about labor income by age as we estimate it in NTA. The basic idea is that this is a population level average at a given age. So we're averaging men and women. We're averaging people who are in the labor force together with people who are not in the labor force. What do we count? Well, we count wages and salaries. We count fringe benefits that you may get from your employer. We try to include both the formal and the informal sectors. We include unpaid family labor, where we have data on self-employment income. We count 2/3 of it as labor income, and the remaining 1/3 is allocated to capital income, or as a return to whatever assets the household may own. Okay, so that's the concept of labor income. It's very broad. And then this is coming from surveys, typically a labor survey. Then we adjust the level of these estimates so that when we multiply them by the population age distribution, we get the same aggregate national totals as are reported in the standard national accounts. So there's a step in which we adjust the age profiles up or down to make sure that they are consistent with national income and product accounts. Okay, and then a last step is that we want to be able to compare these across countries. And of course, with a rich country, they'll be very high, and a poor country, they'll be very low. To make it possible to compare the shapes across countries, we divide the measures of labor income and consumption in each country by the average labor income at ages 30 to 49. And as you will see, this makes it possible to compare countries. Okay, I think now we move to the data. So these are NTA estimates, and I have just formed an average, an unweighted average, for 4 of the poor countries in NTA and for 4 of the rich countries in NTA. So the poor countries included in the blue line average are from Indonesia, India, Philippines, and Kenya. And the rich countries in the red line are Japan, the US, Sweden, and Finland. I could include more countries in these categories. It wouldn't make much difference, but I did not want to include any Latin American countries in the poor countries because I want to be able to compare Latin America to these profiles. Okay, so first of all, we see, not surprising, that in the poor countries, labor income starts at a younger age and it's much higher than it is in the richer countries. There's more child labor in the poor countries. We see that income peaks at earlier ages in the poor countries and at later ages in the rich countries, and we suppose that that's reflecting the fact that labor is more physical, more manual in the poor countries, and that their bodies begin to break down and so on as they get older, whereas in the rich countries, the work is more cerebral, more office jobs, there may be greater returns to experience, and so income remains high longer, peaks later. And then we see that in the rich countries, from this high peak, suddenly in the late 50s and early 60s, labor income drops very rapidly. And that is often reflecting the influence of public pensions, which not only provide income for retirement, but in many cases also provide strong incentives to retire earlier. So the incentives are built into the structure of the pensions. And this is what is now being reformed in many countries in Europe and around the world. We see it in the news every day. Okay. And then finally, we see in old age, the people in the poor countries are working, have substantially higher labor income than the rich countries. They're continuing to work and being productive, and in many cases they may not have a choice. Now here is Latin America in that green line, which I hope you can see. This is an average of the 9 countries for which we now have data in Latin America. Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Mexico, Uruguay, Jamaica, Colombia, Peru, and Argentina. So this is just an unweighted average of those 9 countries. And you can see it looks very similar, perhaps indistinguishable, from this curve for the poor countries. I was surprised. I thought incomes were higher in Latin America, and I expected the curve to look more like the rich industrial countries, but that's not the way it is. Although at older ages, you can see it's somewhere in between. And I'm guessing, but just guessing, that this is reflecting the fact that in Latin America there are many countries with public pensions, which is not usually true in the poorer third world countries. And I imagine then that these public pensions are making it possible for earlier retirement, or in some cases they may include incentives for early retirement. Okay. Now, this is moving to individual Latin American countries. It's just a tangle of lines, but this solid black line is the average we were just looking at, and then the other lines are individuals. Now, as you look at this, it seems to me there's not a lot of systematic variation until you get to the older ages here, where I think we can pick out some different countries. This line that has earlier labor income is Jamaica, and I don't know enough about Jamaica to speculate about what that is reflecting. But focusing at the older ages, we have Mexico and Peru that have higher labor income at older ages. Now, in the case of Mexico, I'm pretty sure this is related to the fact that their public pension system, which has been through many changes, is very relatively low level of benefits, and I think it's not so widely dispersed through the population. So I think it's the absence of a strong public pension program that is going with higher labor at older ages. I don't know enough about Peru to say anything about that. I don't know if Peru has an old age pension system or not. And then in the younger, the lower labor supply in older ages, we have Uruguay and Argentina. Uruguay, I think, has a fairly strong public pension system. Argentina has been through so many changes, I don't really know what to say about that. And then Brazil, here in red, you can see corresponds fairly closely to the Latin American average, but a little bit different in the, what would you say, in the 30s, perhaps the 20s and 30s is a little bit lower, it's a little bit higher, 40s and 50s. And this is echoing a pattern that came through clearly 1996 when this profile looked almost triangular like that, with very early retirement and quite low earnings of young people. And so there have been very substantial changes in the 8 years between 1996 and 2004, which no doubt you all will be able to interpret better than I. I'm not sure when the growth began to really pick up and accelerate in Brazil. If it was early enough along, that might have played a role in the changes between 1996 and 2004, but as I say, I'm no expert in this. Down at this end, I imagine we're mostly seeing the effects of small sample sizes and just kind of random sampling error. Okay, so that's the labor income side. And now what about the consumption side? Okay, consumption in NTA includes private household expenditures for healthcare, for education, but also for everything else: food, a home, clothing, all of these things. And we impute these to different ages within the household. We can't observe that directly, but for health and education, we can do a little bit better in terms of estimating who in the household is getting them. So we include that. That would be quite standard. And then we also include public in-kind transfers. This does not include pensions, because pensions are money, and you might consume using the money, or you might save the money, or you might give it to someone else. So public pensions are not consumption, but in-kind transfers, like a child going to public school, that is that is consuming a costly service provided by the public sector, or somebody receiving health care from a government subsidized program is a kind of consumption. And similarly for long-term care, that means nursing home care for the elderly. Okay, so these are included in consumption, not just private consumption, but public in-kind transfers, which are very important. So we estimate these things for individuals within households, and then we form an average, say at age 23, for all 23-year-olds in all the households in which they live. We pluck them out and just form an average, and that gives us per capita consumption at age 23, for example. And we standardize in the same way that we standardize labor income. So here we are again with rich and poor countries. So poor countries are in blue here, rich are in red, and first we see that in the rich countries there is substantially more investment in human capital of children. This bump here is for healthcare and education. Public education mostly, but sometimes private education. And then we see that in the poor countries, consumption is about the same at all ages. Older people consume about as much as younger adults on average. This often will be because all different ages are living together in extended households and sharing consumption. But that's not always the case. And then finally, we see this dramatic difference between the rich countries and the poor countries, where in the rich countries, consumption is rising rapidly with age, and this is partly reflecting public spending for health care, particularly in the rich countries. That's a very important component of consumption. But at least in the United States, for example, some of it is private consumption also rising. Okay, now if we add Latin America, we have this lime green line, an average of the same countries. And so we see two things. First of all, the general shape is very similar to the shape of the poor countries. It's higher, but it's parallel, more or less. So the other thing we see is that the level is higher relative to labor income. So the ratio of consumption to labor income is higher in Latin America in general, it appears. Now, why might that be? Well, first of all, you can pick this up just looking at national income and product accounts, because you see that there's a higher ratio of aggregate consumption to aggregate labor income in Latin American region than there is elsewhere. So why is this? Well, consumption is also funded by non-labor income, including asset income, and remittances might be important for Latin America, because remittance income coming from abroad we count as a transfer from abroad rather than as labor income of people living in the households in Latin America. And income that funds consumption can come from natural resources too. For example, in Mexico, their oil revenues. And it probably also reflects, for whatever reason, a relatively low level of national saving in the Latin American region. And other people will be able to speak to that better than I. There is a possibility that low saving might be linked to fairly generous public pension programs, but that's just speculation. Why would this be? Because if you're expecting to be supported by a a generous public pension program, then you don't need to save so much during your working years to provide for your own retirement. So savings money.
Antigamente,
Okay, individual